Hi, so working on the project bag. There's a pattern on my website to purchase and download on GourmetQuilter.com. It's called that project bag. I'm going to show you this time how to do the binding around the edge. So the previous videos have shown you various different other aspects of making the bag, but this time we need to bind that edge around there. So I'm going to just show you what I do with that. So I've cut my binding. All the cutting and other instructions are in the pattern. But I've cut the binding 2.5 inches wide. I've got 2 full widths of the fabric here, slightly longer than I need, and I've just joined it on a diagonal so that it doesn't really cause any little lumps and bumps. And at the end I'm going to start sewing. I've just trimmed off the selvage and I've pressed over that corner so that I've got a nice folded angle there so that I can start with that. However, that's the binding ready. We needed to trim down. I've already trimmed around some of the sides of this, and I've already bound this one just so that you can see this is what we're trying to achieve from this raw edge here. So I've already done the base. We have to do the lid of the bag, and I just thought I'd show you how I've trimmed that up. So normally I would trim using a rotary cutter and ruler, and you could do that. You just would need to hold this out of the way, but it's a little bit ungainly with lumps and bumps. So I felt that it was probably easier overall to use some scissors. Now I suggest something fairly sturdy and sharp because it's quite a lot of bulk that we're trying to cut through here, and we just want to trim it back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so we should have a good 1/2 inch or more there. So we want to take off about half of what's there probably, and just go along trimming. I mean, it's really very basic to be showing you trimming. However, when you're handling sort of bulky items and things, sometimes we're not really sure how it's going to work. So I'm just going along trimming happily here and try and keep it as reasonably straight as you can. And then when you finish that trimming, just have a little look at the other side, because sometimes because of this bulk it moves a little bit, and so I've got some bits sticking out here, so I would just come along and just trim those up so it's nice and tidy and a nice as straight an edge as you can reasonably get. It just helps with the whole binding process, particularly when we're doing it by machine, which is I'm going to do both sides by the machine. You may prefer to put it on and then hand slip stitch it down like you might on a quilt. When I bind my quilts I do both sides by machine, so I'm going to do both sides by machine on this bag. I should at this stage warn you that if you like to do the hand slip stitching, that's a good idea. It is quite cumbersome to be turning it over and then machining it. So I don't want to say it's difficult. It's not difficult, but this is bulky and a little bit awkward to manage with the sewing machine. So if you like to hand sew it down, I still suggest you put it on by machine, but you could slip stitch it down. So again, pin your handle out of the way. You don't want to catch that in when we're popping the binding on. Open your bag out. It is pretty ungainly with all this amount hanging around, so give yourself a little bit of space because it sends everything flying off the table. It's funny for some, but not for the rest of us who are trying to actually manage it. So I've got my binding ready to go now. So because I'm going to machine mine down, I'm going to sew it onto the gusset side by machine, and then I'm going to flip it over like on a quilt, and I'm going to machine it out so that it's the machined edge is on the front or the outside of the bag. If you're going to slip stitch it down, you could still put it on this way and slip stitch it to there, but I would suggest you may prefer to sew it on to this side of the bag and slip stitch it down into the gusset area, but that's up to you. I'm going to be doing it this way. You have choices. So I've got my folded pointed end here. I'm just going to start on one of the sides. It doesn't really matter where you start. And I've got my machine all ready to go here. And what I'm going to do is stitch with the normal sort of 1/4 inch seam allowance. You want to be sewing pretty much over the line that you sewed these bits together with. So I'm going to stitch along until I reach the end of this folded over bit, and I'm going to finish off, and then I'm going to skip along and fold this over. I don't pre-press my bindings. I have no really good reason for that. I just prefer to roll it around. I feel it rolls better if I haven't pressed it in half. If you like to press yours in half, that's absolutely fine. And I'm going to start sewing again after I've come along that little double bit. I'm going to have that folded over and start sewing again a couple of inches down from that folded corner there. And then I'm going to continue on round and show you how I do all the corners and things like that. So this, as I said, is a little bulky, so we'll just see how we get on with you being able to see, because it wants to just get in the way of everything. Right, so I've got my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to stitch along that bit. Oh, and I should mention also with your sewing machine at this stage, I would suggest that you might want to use a slightly heavier needle than your regular sewing needle, because this is quite bulky and a little bit testing for a fine needle. So I've got a 90 in there, in case that means anything to you at all. I just like to get my threads out of the way because they irritate me a little, and we don't want me being irritated even a little. Okay, so I'm folding that over now. I'm going to leave a gap because I'm going to tuck the other end into that gap. So I'm coming down a couple of inches or so and start sewing again. So I work with my needle staying down in the fabric so that I can take my hands away, and I apply just an ever so slight amount of tension on my binding when I put, this is the same when I'm doing the quilt, just a little bit, just so that it holds it nice and smooth. You don't want it too tight, you don't want it wrenched tight, just a little bit of tension, and just make sure that your underneath bits are sitting nice and flat out as well. And when I'm coming up to a corner here, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm just going to fold that, and if it would be of any help at all, I have some clips here. You may want to pop a clip just to hold that folded, or a pin or something. That'll just ease one of your hands, because you've only got 2 and you really need 3. So I'm coming up to the corner, so I'm going to stop and do a little back stitch 1/4 inch before I get to the actual corner, so that I can do the little foldy thing on the corners, same as I do on a quilt. Do a little back stitch. I like to take it out and do this because it's easier, I find. Now I'm actually, just for this purpose, going to fold that in and clip it again. This is all quite bulky and it makes the corners harder than it needs to. However, that's the way it is. So we've come there. I'm going to fold that so that I've got a diagonal fold here, which should go right out through the corner of the bag or the quilt, whatever it is that you're binding. And I'm going to fold it back so that the fold is right along the raw edges. So it's like a mitre fold. And then I am going to put another little clip in because of the bulk, just to hold that. So if I put that little clip and hold that there, I'm going to start sewing right from the edge here, and that clip won't be in the way. So I'm coming around the corner. Make sure these bits are out of your way underneath here. You don't want to be struggling with those with the foot of the sewing machine. It is bulky at the corner, so just take your time. As you can see, I'm taking my time. And I'm going to start right on the edge there, and I'm going to come along. Just take it slowly. If you've got a little bit of extra bulk and things like that when you're sewing with the machine, if you just go slower, if there is a problem and it's resisting, you're not hitting something hard, it's just a gentler way, and quite often it will work better if you just take it gently. So I'm just going to keep on going now. So I'm going to do that same treatment every time I get to the corner. I'm going to stop 1/4 inch before I get there, finish it off with a little back stitch, take it out, fold it through the diagonal and along the raw edge, and then and put it back in again, just the same as I've done, all the way around till I get to the other side. So that will be the same. So here I am, I'm coming around my final corner, back, if you can see this, back to where we started, that little bit there, and I'm going to stitch right onto that little pointy bit. And then I'm going to come along just a little inch or so further, probably. And then I'm going to just trim this. So this needs to tuck into this little bit that's flapping up here. So I'm going to trim this a little bit shorter than the space is so that it'll tuck in nicely. Don't need that last bit there. And then we're just going to pop that inside there so that when we sew it, we want to bring that down nice and smooth and bring the little folded bit over so that everything's sitting nice and firm for binding, and join up back to the stitching down here. Now because I tucked that in, there's a little tiny bit sticking out. That's absolutely fine, we don't need that bit, and we can just trim that off so it's not adding extra bulk. And so that's the binding on. So if you were going to hand stitch that down, now would be a good time to do that. That will just flip over and give you the little miters at the corners. I'm actually going to go around and machine mine in place, so I'll just get started. Much the same thing as I've been doing, only on the other side. So it's just a matter of flipping that over now to this side. Now you do get just a tiny little line of stitching sometimes just next to the binding when you do it by machine like this, but for me that's not an issue. It doesn't really show unless you really go looking for it. So I'm just going to pop that in, doesn't really matter where you start. And so you want to sew close to the fold, so we're just folding that over. So I'll just go up and round a corner so you can see how that works. And then it's just all the way around the same thing. So I'm close to that fold, pretty much on top of the other stitching line that we've just put the binding on with, which was the stitching line we used to sew the bits together with. I'm coming up to a corner here, so I'll just get a bit closer. And you may find that a pin is handy for something like this, because we're working with all this bulk. We want that to bring that straight line straight through, and then we want to fold that over so that we end up with a little miter at that corner. Because we've got this bulk underneath at the sides of the bag, I would suggest you might find a little pin just holding that corner in place as you come to it would be quite handy. And just take it slowly, because this is quite bulky and it just wants to have a little life of its own. Until you get that needle into that corner, leave the needle down and you can swivel that around. And when I do these sort of corners, particularly on something bulky like this, I actually like to just do a little back stitch, just stitch back, and then I can move forward again. And keep on going all the way around the edge till I've done all 4 corners and got back to where I started. So here I am coming up that final little straight, back to where I started, putting my binding on. Woohoo, we are done. So just take your time when you're going around. Coming along this back segment here, there's a couple of bulky, so I'll just snip my threads off here. There's a couple of bulky bits where we had that seam there, so just take it slowly across those. But overall, I'm very pleased with the way that's come up. I can now snip off my threads, unpin my handle, and we can have a look and see how it's all behaving. Well, I think that's quite good. That's all sitting on there nicely. That's my bag. There's my zippers. So even with all that sort of manipulating, and there is a little bit of manipulating to do when you're sewing something like this, this is withstanding very nicely. It's holding its shape really well. We are just about set to go. So that's how to put the binding on to the edges on the bag as we're joining it up. We'll come back and do some more tutorials on some of the bits and pieces that are going to go inside. Remember, there's that nice piece that comes in and out that has the pockets, and a nice little workboard as well. So looking good so far. There's the bag. Next time we'll do some of the inside bits.